The following is an Operation Podcast production.
What is the meaning of life?
I think there's many, many meanings of life. I think there's a way to navigate life that's enjoyable. I think it requires many things.
Why does it seem to always come down to a religious view and then a scientific view? Are those the only two camps?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that question before. This is an attempt to bring together two topics that at least some in the scientific community had said these can't ever go together. You know, you think of evolution as a giant tree, or at least that's how it's sometimes portrayed. And you have things on very different parts of the tree that develop the same things independently. It's not just in mating and reproduction, again, also in selfishness and altruism, in aggression and cooperation, in cruelty and kindness, right? There's this duality to our nature. Evolution has shaped us so that we have both. This is what I refer to as the dual potential of human nature. I've used kind of biological terms, but if you're maybe taking it from another angle, theological, you would say good and evil. Okay. And when you combine that with the capacity that we have to choose free will, to me it seems like life is a test between the kind of the selfishness and the altruism within us.
Sam, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, Chase. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Light work, light conversation today. And I want my audience to know that as we're recording this, it's barely after 10 a.m. in the morning, and we're jumping into two very light topics such as human evolution and the meaning of life.
Yeah.
I had a curiosity out of the gate. How did those two topics come to mind as something that you wanted to write a book about? What is it about human evolution and human meaning that you feel deserves attention and even cross paths?
Yeah, a lot of this goes back to about 15 years ago. I was in medical school, and for a long time in the literature about evolution, there has been this sense that there's no such thing as purpose in evolution. There's no such thing as meaning. It's all just an illusion. And I didn't like that. There was this period I went through back then as a medical student where I kind of had this struggle, you could maybe call it an existential crisis, where I thought that what I was learning in medical school and science and thinking, I was reading, I was meditating, I'm a religious person, I was praying. And then in a way that's kind of hard to describe, things just kind of came together. And I decided at that point that I wanted to write a book. And so there's a little bit of a personal narrative behind that, but this is an attempt to bring together two topics that at least some in the scientific community had said these can't ever go together.
You start off the work kind of talking about two main categories. Many have compartmentalized how we view the world into these two main categories, a scientific worldview and a religious one.
Yeah.
Why does it always seem to come down to those two buckets? When we look at how did we get here and why are we here, why does it seem to always come down to a religious view and then a scientific view? Are those the only two camps?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that question before. I sometimes in one of the camps, people will say a religious and or philosophical view, and part of it just has to do with the fact that certain questions seem to be, at least at this point, outside of what we can find out or learn or discover through the scientific process. And sometimes people will say, well, a lot of the questions of how, those are questions that are relevant to science, and science can help us inform us about, okay, how does this work? How does that work? But other questions of maybe why do we, why is there suffering? Why are we here? Science seems not to be able to offer answers that, at least for a lot of people, are
no hard answers, no like ultimatums like A plus B equals C for sure all the time.
Yeah. So in some ways it's like, well, science has this kind of realm, and everything outside of there maybe religion or philosophy might be able to shed some light on this.
You mentioned earlier that you're a religious man, and correct me if I'm wrong, Latter-day Saint, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I come from a religious background as well. Grew up Southern Baptist, pretty much aligned still with Christianity. I've definitely, I'm wearing beads now, so I feel like I'm very much into the spiritual health aspect, outside of just religion. But you remind me of, I had a guest late last year, Dr. Tara Swart.
Okay.
Familiar with her?
I'm not, unfortunately.
Okay. She's from the UK and also an MD, traditionally trained doctor, but is now talking about manifestation and spirituality.
Yeah.
And she discusses how the more that she became well-versed in the medical community, the scientific community, it became so much more apparent to her that there were way more things in the spiritual aspect, the non-scientifically explainable things of life, meaning how did we get here, that kind of pulled her even more and more. I'm curious, did the same thing happen to you? Would you say you were more religious going into the scientific community or vice versa, or you kind of feel like you're in a blend of the two?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I'm a blend of the two. I for the most part, I feel very at home in science. That wasn't always the case, right? And this goes back to this kind of struggle I had. I think science can be a very, very powerful tool, and it has been able to help us to live better lives, to eliminate or reduce suffering. But at the same time, I think most people would argue and accept that there's still a lot of problems that we have, some of which are not, at least at the our current understanding, science may not be able to help us with so much. That so many of the social problems are problems of how do we help people to behave in better ways and so forth. Science can inform us in that sense, but I think there is a realm of the universe that at current moment science doesn't really seem to have any access to, and it's also of great interest to me. I think when we go to that area, we got to be careful because lots of people are going to have different ways they interpret it, and we need to respect one another's differences of opinion where evidence isn't so clear, and I think coercion in terms of is a place we want to stay away from, right?
To kind of bring it back to your work around the concept of evolution, couldn't the argument be made that where we deem the line of science ends and spirituality, the unexplained aspects of life, come and start? It's just a matter of humans haven't evolved quite yet. Science hasn't evolved quite yet to give us the answers. I think back to 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, things that we thought were mystical and unexplainable and maybe were lobbed into kind of that non-scientific realm. 50 years later, 100 years later, 500 years later, science did have meaning for it and reasons for it. So my question, I guess, is all non-scientific parts of human experience and evolution just a matter of time until we catch up?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what you're alluding to is what some might call, so some people of religious faith, they maybe put their faith in where we don't understand. You might call this a God of the gaps. So, my God explains what science can't explain. And I think that's maybe not, if you're a person of faith, that's a little bit of shaky ground, because, as you've alluded to, science often fills in those gaps later. And so if it fills in those gaps and you say, well, this is where God used to be, then you have a shrinking God. My conception of deity, of the divine, is an entity, really in my personal beliefs, a person-like entity that kind of understands the principles and laws by which the universe is governed, and uses those principles to kind of further the divine work. So I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of existence, when there's some sense that the curtain will be unfolded and we'll kind of see things as they really are.
The wizard pops out from behind the curtain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That things can be explained. Things that now are mysterious to us and wonderful to us can be explained. That, at least for me, won't necessarily take away from the wonder and the awe. And in some ways, it might enhance it. So just because you can't explain maybe spiritual phenomena doesn't mean that you will never be able to. And when you are able to, it doesn't necessarily make it less wonderful or less miraculous. Okay, so what is wonderful or what is miraculous? I mean, the process by which life happens. You have a like reproduction, for instance. You have two cells that fuse, right? We don't necessarily have to go into the details, but there's this process.
Ask your parents, everybody. Yeah. when a man loves a woman.
Yeah, exactly. Embryogenesis, where you have this single cell. All of us, our existence, our mortal existence, started as a single cell, and after just about 40 cycles of division, of replication of that cell, you have essentially a fully formed human being. We understand some of this. There's still a lot we don't understand about how there's this cascade of genes that turn on and off, and very complex biochemical processes. It's a miracle, but there seems to be an order and laws and principles that kind of govern this.
Yeah.
But even when we can maybe understand every little kind of nook and cranny of this process, it's still going to be wow. Like it's amazing. So again, at the end of the day, at the end of existence, when the curtain kind of opens and we can maybe see things as they really are, I think you will be able to explain even maybe spiritual phenomena that to our current understanding is like out of reach. But that won't necessarily make it less wonderful or less miraculous. Does that make sense?
It does. And with my background in health and fitness, I always go to these physiology and nutrition analogies, fitness analogies. It makes me think of the way that we can just eat food stuff, the way that we can put food, drink, nutrients, calories into our body, get energy, build muscle, maintain body composition, have all these things, nourish a growing fetus. Doesn't make it any more magical when I, in undergrad, discovered the Krebs cycle. Yeah. When I looked at, Krebs cycle glycolysis, this is how we actually break down foodstuffs, create energy, and that there's the scientific explanation. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like the more science I understand and the more scientific explanations I get for things that beforehand were just like, oh, wow, that's incredible. Like, how is this happening? It almost, to your point, adds another layer, an even more magical layer of, wow, that's an explanation for what's happening, but where did all that come from? What's the divine or the design behind it? Yeah. And for me, that kind of comes into the world of, well, now we're talking about consciousness and, what is really the essence of that and the design behind that.
Still a big mystery there, I think,
to say the least.
We're I think, many, many years off from understanding this, what some would call the hard problem of consciousness. In my field, we might call it the mind-brain gap. How do these physical things like neurons and neurotransmitters somehow spring forth to these intangible things like thoughts, emotions, the sense of I.
Like how did the neuron get there? How did the dendrite get there? How did they make these connections? We can explain all the electrolytes and neural connectivities and all that, but then it's like, how did they get there? Who decided that they were going to talk to this, and when they come together, it causes a thought or memory or emotion? Now I'm just kind of getting in my own rabbit hole, but in writing this book, I'm always curious with authors, and especially someone like yourself who's had so many years in the medical field. What stood out to you the most? What was the biggest surprise when looking at the human experience, particularly human evolution? Was something really solidified for you, or did you make a discovery? What is it about the human experience that really stood out to you most?
There were a lot of kind of surprises along the way. I guess I was just surprised at least from my take, how compelling the evidence is for some of these principles. One of the things that I thought evolution implied about just the nature of the universe is how random things were, right? I think most people, when they think, oh, the theory of evolution, it's kind of random change, right? And I think there is some level of randomness.
Is that the concept of entropy? Like everything will always go into chaos?
Well, kind of, but the assumption has always been, right, these molecular mutations that drive evolutionary change are random, and henceforth, evolution doesn't know where it's going, and henceforth, life is a fortunate but still an accident.
There's no roadmap; it's just pure accident.
And so then henceforth, there's no purpose or meaning, right? It's just kind of this fluke set of circumstances and events that unfolded in a way that for us is fortunate, but doesn't really have any purpose or meaning. And I think that is a kind of a view of the data that has changed, and there's a lot of compelling data to suggest an alternative way to understand the process. And this has to do with the phenomenon where different you think of evolution as a giant tree, or at least that's how it's sometimes portrayed, and you have things on very different parts of the tree that develop the same things independently. Meaning, so I'll give you an example. So birds, bats, and butterflies, they all have wings, and they can all fly, obviously. But scientists tell us that they each independently developed wings, separate, right? And so it's like,
it's not like they're all part of the winged community.
Correct, right? The bat is a mammal. A bird is it's a bird. A butterfly is an insect. So they, not all mammals have wings. And so they each independently and separately developed this capacity. So you're like, that's curious, right? Maybe another example, a shark and a dolphin. Okay, they look very, very similar, right? You would think that they're closely related, but they're really not. So the dolphin is a mammal, and we're told the dolphin's ancestors lived on land. And somehow, over time, the dolphin kind of went back into the water, and the appendages, the arms and legs, if you will, they kind of devolved into fins and flippers, okay? Whereas a shark is a fish, okay? So a dolphin has a skeleton of bone, kind of like you and I, whereas a shark has a skeleton of cartilage, okay? But they look extremely similar. You would think they were very closely related, but they're not. They each independently developed this very, very similar form, which helps them swim well, okay? And even some of the counter shading. So many species of dolphins and sharks have this dark counter shading on top and this light shading on the bottom. And this helps them be camouflaged in the water, right? If you're looking up, you see this white and it kind of blends into the light. If you're looking down, you see dark and it blends in with the dark. So this obviously helps them either evade predators or sneak up on prey, maybe in the instance of the shark. You're like, there's these patterns that keep recurring. Another example is the eye. This is maybe one of the most famous examples. Eyes have developed independently about 40 different times.
The human eye.
Well,
or just eyeballs in general.
Eyes in general. There's a couple different types of eye. The type of eye that we have is called a camera type eye, and we have almost exactly the same structure of eye as an octopus or squid. But we're not that closely related. And so we each independently developed basically the same identical structure. Okay, so you're like, what's going on here? You get this pattern over and over and over again where there's this quote I like. It says, once is an instance, twice maybe a coincidence, but 3 times or more makes a pattern. And at this point, pretty much everything has evolved more than once. So I'm drawing potentially theological or religious implications from this. But even Richard Dawkins, who's probably our generation's most outspoken atheist, for those of you who never heard of him, he would agree that this pattern, holds. In fact, he once asked a friend of his, a colleague, biologist, he said, can you think of, quote, good ideas that have developed only once? And his friend could only think of a handful. So you think
that's a tough question.
Well, yeah. When you think of the hundreds and even thousands, maybe 10,000s of kind of structures, biological structures and quote, good ideas that have developed, almost all of them have developed more than once. So you're like, well, was it really random? And I think the answer is, well, it was a mix of randomness and non-randomness. So like your eyes, your eye color may be a random reassortment of your parents' genes, but the fact that you have eyes and that they're structured the way they are seems to be kind of intrinsic to the self-organizing principles of biological matter. So it's this kind of mix of, and I think the ratio of non-randomness to randomness is much greater than we may. In other words, it was much more of a non-random process than people originally understood. So for me, that was very satisfying to say, okay, maybe life wasn't just an accident. Maybe it's like inherent in the principles of biology, chemistry, and physics that, life developed like it did.
You hit on such a great point that I wanted to cover. I just wrote down evolution, random chance or guided process. And I feel like you kind of brought us there. Mm-hmm. Staying on topic right now with the evolution aspect and this human experience, where do you think right now, 2024, humans are the least evolved? Where do you think we have the most room, or where do you maybe see as the next step in evolution in the human experience?
That's a good question. It's a process, as we understand, that moves very slowly. And so for our time scales, the average age, life expectancy, maybe in the U.S. is somewhere around 75 or 80 years.
Oh, we'll keep biohacking. We'll come back in 1,000 years. We'll revisit this. Yeah. I want a benchmark.
Where are we going? That's a good question. I mean,
what is even possible in between now and 3024? What do you think is possible?
Well, I don't think in just 1,000 years there's not a whole lot of biological change. Certainly there's what you would call cultural evolution, and this can happen quite rapidly, and especially as our technologies advance. We've got AI, we've got the internet. We're just incredibly connected, and there are benefits to that. There are also drawbacks to that. That we're, especially in mental health, there are serious problems with the way, especially teenagers, young adults are connecting these days,
or not
connecting in person because they're quote connected, through virtual means. I couldn't tell you there's going to be this physical change and we're going to grow a third arm or something like that. I don't think that's going to happen. Culturally, I think we could go a couple different ways. And what I hope is that we can, a lot of people think we're going to annihilate ourselves. And a lot of people think we're going to, contribute so much to changing of the climate that the Earth is just going to fry.
We won't even be here in 1,000 years.
I don't think that's necessarily the case. But the most urgent problems that I see that we have are social problems and problems that have their root in the fact that we have this immense capacity to be selfish and aggressive, but we also have an immense capacity to be loving and caring and cooperative and look out for others before ourselves. So
all by just a choice, really. You could choose to act out of compassion or love, or choose to act out of fear or hatred. That's a very boiled down statement, but
well, I would agree with that. Obviously, there's some.
But it doesn't take a
details.
Massive physiological change or evolutionary change for us to go. You know what? I think I'm just not being an asshole anymore. I think I'm going to love my neighbor.
Yeah. Certainly, biology and culture and where you come from, they play into that, right? And it is very complex. One of the things that I think is very interesting and important is to understand what sorts of situations will help people to be on their best behavior. So, one maybe just example of this is a lot of people feel this intense sense of compassion and desire to do good when something really tragic happens. Okay, so
I have to make meaning out of this.
What, or I, this poor unfortunate soul. I got to help them. I got to reach out. So I'll give you an example of this. I live in Connecticut, and it was 12 years ago. 11 or 12 years ago, there was this terrible shooting at a school in Newtown, Connecticut. It's called Sandy Hook. You may remember this. And this, he was probably 20 or 25, walked in and just started shooting up the elementary school. It was just terrible. I can't remember exactly how many children died, but a number of them did. And I live about 30 or 45 minutes from there, and our church congregation, we heard about this. Oh, this is terrible. We want to do something. We want to make like care kits or something like that. And so there was a group that got together that next Sunday, and they were getting ready to try to do something. Lo and behold, we learned that all of the siblings of the children who died, basically their future college tuition had already been paid for, just by this overwhelming outpouring of support and love from across the country, right? Because people were just, their heartstrings were pulled, and they said, "This is such a terrible thing. I want to help. I want to reach out and be compassionate." Right? So
that's amazing. I would argue, I would rather see a pool of money for their future therapy.
Well, I mean,
mental health.
They probably didn't.
That's a massive
stipulate.
trauma.
Yeah, I'm not sure they stipulated it had to be called. But a huge outpouring of
still,
financial.
it's incredible. Absolutely,
yeah. So you see that over and over again, where there's a tragedy, there's this intense surge of compassion. Now that's interesting, but you can't really necessarily, you shouldn't, I would say, try to engineer like tragedies so that people are on their best behavior. So I think we need to look for other ways, other kind of social contexts in which people are on their best behavior. And one of the conclusions that I've come to, and I think the data behind this is just very, very compelling, is that when people, and especially men, I'm gonna not to pick on men, but a lot of the violent crime in our society is at the hands of men. But when men are tied to the rearing of their children, they tend to be on their better behavior. Okay, they are more. They want their neighborhood to be good. They want their kids to grow up in a place that's safe, and so they get drawn into the community in ways that maybe they otherwise wouldn't if they were maybe not connected.
Is this the part in your book you're talking about, kind of the why of monogamy?
Well, that's part of it. I do think monogamy is a huge kind of achievement of our race, but it is very related to that. Why some people look and they'll say, well, look, human nature, we're not monogamous by nature, and so this kind of society it kind of goes against it.
Evolutionarily speaking, right, or biologically speaking, that's kind of the argument behind that. We're not not meant to be monogamous.
I would say it's not that simple, and that there is a drive that we do have also to be monogamous, and in a lot of ways, in a lot of kind of traits, we are pulled in different directions, right? So I alluded to this earlier. We have with one person, with one partner, and we kind of are stuck in the middle, okay? And people who study, they call them non-human primates. We're categorized as primates. Other primates, chimpanzees and so forth. There's this pattern, this physical pattern, where you can predict just by looking at the structural difference between men and women, males and females rather, in these primates, whether they behave in like a monogamous way or a non-monogamous way.
How? What does that look like?
Well, so
like their actual physical features?
Yeah, it's pretty simple actually. So let's say you discover a new species that is a primate. Two new species. Okay, and one is species A, and the other is species B. Okay, this is drawn on the work from a Stanford professor, Robert Sapolsky. But so species A, let's say the males and the females are pretty much identical in size and appearance, okay, and outward appearance. So they look identical. Species B, the males are much larger than the females, okay, and in addition, they have their faces look different. They have these elaborate facial, coloration or trappings, and so just from those kind of differences, what we call the academic term is sexual dimorphism, meaning differences in characteristics. Physical characteristics between males and females, you can predict what kind of mating strategies and patterns that they will have. Okay, so the species A, where the males and females are essentially identical size and so forth, they have long-term pair bonding, or what we would call monogamy. Okay, species B, a very few proportion of males do almost all the mating, and basically you have what would essentially be a harem. Okay, so you have an alpha male that is able to get a harem of females and mate with all of them.
Going for the procreation game.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and you have a very, very small proportion of the males doing almost all the reproducing. Okay, whereas in the other species A, where they're more or less the males and females are the same size, almost all of the males have a few offspring. Okay, and so they are more kind of invested in their children. In species B, where you have the very large males, the male, the king male, the alpha male has essentially no what we call parental investing in the children. So he doesn't really he doesn't really take care of the kids.
He's like, I did my job. Procreated. Mom, take care of it.
Exactly. All right. And so you look at humans and you say, well, are we like species A or are we like species B?
Yeah, I have to ask this. This question's burning in my mind. Can we look at males and go, based on how you look, certain physical features predict you're going to be monogamous or non-monogamous?
Well, I would say it's a choice. I would say that every male is going to be pulled in different directions. So going back to this species A and species B, you say which ones do humans fit in? Are we like species A or are we like species B? And we're kind of in the middle, right? I mean, men and women, they do have differences. Men are on average about maybe 25% larger than females, than women. There are some differences in the face. Men readily grow facial hair. There are some other kind of subtle differences as well. But the difference isn't quite as big as maybe the species B, where you have this male that's like twice the size of the female, and the face looks totally different. So we are literally somewhere in between. Okay, and so you're saying, can I look at a human male and predict, is this person going to be monogamous or promiscuous? I would say that each male, and to some degree females as well, but to a lesser degree, each male has is pulled in different directions. Okay, and so there is some truth when people say, "Oh, we're not natural." It's not in our nature to be monogamous. I say, well, which nature are you talking about? Because it's not.
Yeah, is that biology? Is it spirituality? Is it consciousness? You say we're kind of somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
What's the defining factor that is keeping us in the middle?
Well, culture is a big one. Okay, so what culture you live in obviously has a big influence on kind of the behaviors that you will learn and follow and so forth. But even from a biological sense, if you strip it down to just the biology, that's kind of impossible to do. But if you could, I think what you would see is there's this kind of duality. There's this tension, and it runs down the line. It's not just in mating and reproduction, although it is there too, but again also in selfishness and altruism, in aggression and cooperation, in cruelty and kindness, right? There's this duality to our nature that in this really, to me, it was an unexpected way. Evolution has shaped us so that we have both, okay? And this is what I refer to as the dual potential of human nature, okay? I've used kind of biological terms, but if you're maybe taking it from another angle, theological, you would say good and evil. Okay, right? Some people don't like those terms, but others resonate with them. And when you combine that with the capacity that we have to choose, right, free will, to me it seems like life is a test, right? Between the kind of the selfishness and the altruism within us. There's this, when I was young, I used to watch cartoons, and there's this kind of cliche motif of a man walking down the street, and he has an angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other, right? Whispering in his ears. And I think
don't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't do it.
I think that's maybe truer to reality than we might recognize. And this is one of the reasons that life is so hard, right? It's because we're biologically, it's like in our DNA to be pulled in more than one direction. Okay. And so this is what I think. This is one of the purposes of life, that life is essentially a test of character. Okay. And I think this is a truth that a lot of the major world religions have kind of honed in on, even before, there was a theory of evolution and so forth. So to me, in this area, I see a kind of a coming together where, a lot of people perceive this conflict between science and faith. I see in this way they can be reinforcing.
I agree so wholeheartedly. And again, I'll reiterate, the more that I have come to understand about one, the more I kind of tend to lean towards the other. It goes for the more that I figure out magical, mystical, heart-centered, emotional, spiritual things, it makes me appreciate the actual existence of life and how amazing the scientific process of life and just us existing on this spinning giant rock 1,000 miles an hour going in infinite directions at all times into nothingness is like, that's fucking wild. Yeah. But then the more I kind of lean into like the science of everything, and just like, oh, there has to be this inexplicable design, meaning behind it all. We can't have one without the other. But getting into kind of the meaning of life, to kind of your last point there, I have some quotes and references about the meaning of life from, to your point, some different cultures, communities, even religions. And I'd be curious just to kind of get your hot take on it.
Sure, yeah.
So my first one actually is from the Baha'i faith. And this is personal to me. My wife and all her family, they're Iranian-American Persian of the Baha'i faith. I believe it's a beautiful religion. Technically, it's one of the newer religions, you can say. It's been around only, air quote, a few hundred years. Yeah. But it's a very widely accepting one. But the Baha'i faith says, quote, the supreme cause for creating the world and all that is therein is for man to know God. How does that land on you?
Oh, I think it resonates with me. One of the in this book that I wrote, I tried to stay away from some of the theology and lean a lot on the science, in part because it's hard to answer what is God, right? I do think
how much time you got?
Yeah, yeah. I do think that is another important purpose to life is to figure out and to wrestle with what is God? How can I know God? And there's not a scientific consensus on this, as a lot of scientists think there's no God, and this is just a made up wishful thinking that we should abandon. But I do have a deep conviction that there is a higher power, and known by different names, and that yes, part of the reason why we're here is to do our best to search out, even though we kind of can't see a lot, search out what that means, and what does that imply about how I should treat other people? So yeah, no, I like that.
Next up, coming from the Gospel of Matthew, from I don't know the version here, NIV, King James, whatever, from the Bible. Matthew 10, chapter 10, verse 39 says, if you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for me, you will find it.
I like that verse a lot. And if we can go a little bit on the side here. So the study of happiness, and well-being, there's a lot we can dig into, but it's pretty clear that the most important factor for happiness and well-being is your relationships.
Quality of our relationships. The Happiness Project, right? The Good Life Project from Harvard.
Yep. Yeah. Robert Waldinger.
Yeah. And, he was on the show last year.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Obviously, really important. Not only that project. I mean, that's a very, very impressive project, especially in how long it's been going. 80 some years. I
think 85 years now. The longest longitudinal human study on all-cause mortality, chronic illness, disease, happiness.
Yeah, and that's one of the main findings. But lots of other studies as well, that the key to happiness and well-being is your relationships with other people. And, I think a lot of people would agree that we're in the midst of a mental health crisis, right? Depression, anxiety, and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of potential reasons for this, but one of them is just we have our culture in the West has increasingly been focused on personal fulfillment and individual kind of status, and there is something to be said for that. And there is a measure of well-being that comes from attaining a goal or an achievement and so forth. But to the effect that you focus so much on that your personal relationships crumble, then that is, I think, what that verse means, that you find you're looking for your life and you lose it because we all want to be happy, but we have these what I would call cognitive illusions. We're not very good. It turns out we're not very good at predicting what is going to make us happy. Okay,
and how often does our happiness change? We latch on to something, this person, this relationship, this job, this workout, and then 2, 3, 5 years, 10, 20 years later, you don't want anything to do with it. You moved on.
Yeah. Well, yeah, life is fickle, and that's part of it. Another aspect is that we tend to overestimate how much happiness we're going to get from an achievement. Okay, so a couple of months ago, I was in this training for young professors at Yale, and it was a small group, maybe 15 people. At the very end of this 2-day training, they asked, what are your kind of life goals? And a couple of people started to open up after this initial period where everyone's a little bit like they don't want to shit. It's kind of personal.
No one wants to go first, right?
Yeah. So one person said that she wanted to win the Nobel Prize, which is like probably the most coveted, if I can use that word, achievement in science. And it just got me thinking, why is it that we want to do this? And for a lot of us who think, if I win the Nobel Prize, I win the lottery, whatever, I'm going to finally be happy. But that's a trap.
If then, well, that's what we think.
Well, like say you won, I don't know what the what the coveted prize is for like podcasters. Say you win like
I know exactly what it would be. For me, it would be like instead of everyone going, I heard on Joe Rogan or I heard on Huberman Lab, it would go, I heard on Everford Radio.
I heard on Everford.
We're working on it.
So say you get there though.
Yeah.
Is that going to really meaningfully affect your happiness? Maybe for the first couple of weeks or months.
It'd be cool to hear, but would it change my day-to-day work or my meaning? No.
Yeah.
It'd be cool, but
yeah. So another really interesting, an interesting study, it was an influential study from the 1970s that drove this home, had this provocative title of, it was called Accident Victims and Lottery Winners. Okay, and so what they did is they examined 2 very different groups of people. One group had won the lottery, and the other group had suffered terrible accidents to where they were, paraplegic. They lost the use of multiple limbs. And, if I ask you which group would you rather be in, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? But when they asked them, how much reward do you get from these daily tasks and so forth, the groups weren't really that different, okay? And by and large, the accident victims, they reported they were more happy than not. And so this just illustrates this principle that, one, we're not very good at predicting what's going to make us happy. 2, there's this psychological concept called hedonic adaptation. Hedonic means pleasure or enjoyment.
Yeah, this was in your the lust and love section of the book, I believe.
Close to it. Yeah. Which is essentially, the hedonic adaptation means essentially that you are going to adapt to, for better and for worse, your happiness set point is kind of going to go back to where it was after a lot of events. Okay. So you win the lottery, you feel good for a month or 2, whatever, but then exception to this rule, however, is relationships. Is that warm and intimate and caring relationships really do modify your happiness set point. So I know this is I went on a crazy kind of tangent, but this verse you quoted from Matthew, that I know it essentially as he that seeketh his life shall lose it, right? And that if you are seeking your life in terms of individual status and accomplishment and achievement to the detriment of personal relationships, that is a recipe for being lonely and miserable. And so there's this balance. Not that we shouldn't be striving to improve ourselves and so forth, but there's a balance that you have to maintain.
Amen. Absolutely. I have I have several more, but
Okay.
I do have. Before I get to my clip, we're gonna do clips now, everybody.
Sure.
I have a clip that I think a lot of people speaking of will appreciate from Joe Rogan.
Okay.
But I do want to ask a couple more. I'm trying to just be as inclusive as possible because I do pull a lot of meaning out of my life and how I become more creative and how I find better questions is by looking at a lot of different walks of life, faiths, sects, beliefs. And so I look at Buddhism now.
Okay.
Buddhism claims that life has meaning only if it is understood as a mere stepping stone to an enlightenment in which the self escapes from worldly concerns. I feel like we're running pretty parallel to the Matthew quote, but this is just another point that there are so many similarities in meaning for life across so many religions and belief systems. So with this Buddhism quote from the Matthew quote, are we kind of landing on the same thing?
I think a similar conclusion where, worldly things, money, status, possessions, those sorts of things, they're necessary to live, some baseline level of them. But if you attach yourself to them, that's, I think, what this quote from Buddhism is kind of warning against. That's not where you want to be going. That's not where you're going to find meaning and fulfillment.
Now, everyone's favorite Canadian, Jordan Peterson. All right. The purpose of life, as far as I can tell, is to find a mode of being that's so meaningful that the fact that life is suffering is no longer relevant.
That's interesting. Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, so much of when you ask people, where do they find meaning, it has to do with being a part of something that is bigger than yourself, and that you are contributing to a cause that is bigger than yourself. So I think that when people really buy into that, whether it's like you were in the military, being part of a team in the military, you probably went through lots of crazy and difficult things, right, in the military.
A few,
but you went through it, and you were able to kind of get through it. Hopefully, not focusing on the time you spent sweating and toiling,
cutting the grass with scissors.
Who knows?
That's a real thing, everybody. That's a real thing. Yeah.
So, but you were able to go through that, and you had this sense of I'm assuming here maybe
camaraderie.
But camaraderie, belonging.
I would not have survived without the men and women to the left and right of me.
Correct.
For years.
Correct. Right, and you were able to get through that suffering because of that, because you attached your meaning to being a part of this group and this team that was larger than you. You were serving a greater purpose. So, yeah, I think that makes sense.
All right, now let's roll that beautiful bean footage for Mr. Joe Rogan.
Okay.
This is actually a clip he was a guest on the Lex Friedman podcast. Lex is a really, really interesting guy, has another huge podcast out of Austin, Texas. He has I appreciate a lot of his approaches to conversations and thoughts, and he's a very deep guy. And so to have these two guys sit down together to talk about the meaning of life, I was very intrigued by. So this is Lex Friedman asking Joe Rogan the meaning of life. And if you got to check out the video for this one. I'm going to pull it up on the screen, but you'll be able to hear it in the audio as well.
Last question. I sometimes ask this just to challenge, to make people roll their eyes, to make legitimate scientists roll their eyes. What is the meaning of life?
Are you familiar with Lex?
I do not think there is a meaning. I think there's many, many meanings of life. I think there's a way to navigate life that's enjoyable. I think it requires many things. First of all, it requires love. You have to have loved ones, you have to have family, you have to have friends, you have to have people that care about you, and you have to care about them. I think that is primary. Then it also requires interests. There has to be things that stimulate you. Now, it could be just a subsistence lifestyle. There's many people that believe and practice this lifestyle of just living off the land and hunting and fishing and living in the woods, and they seem incredibly happy.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said for that. That is an interest, right? There's something, and there's a direct connection between their actions and their sustenance. They get their food that way. They're connected to nature, and it's very satisfying for them. if you don't have that, I think you need something that is interesting to you, something you're passionate about. And there's far too many people that get sucked into living a life where you're just doing a job. You're just showing up and putting in your time and then going home, but you don't have a passion for what you're doing. And I think that's a recipe for a boring and very unfulfilling life.
You mentioned love. If we could just backtrack, what we talked about the demons and the violence in there somewhere. What's the role of love in your own life?
It's very important, man. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in helping people. I'm very interested in people feeling good. I like them to feel good. I want to help them. I like doing things that make them feel like, oh, you care about me. Like, yeah, I care about you. I really do. Like, I want people to feel good. I want my family to feel good. I want my friends to feel good. I want guests to feel good about the podcast experience. You know, I'm a big believer in, as much as I can, to spread positive energy and joy and happiness and relay all the good advice that I've ever gotten, all the things that I've learned. And if they can benefit people, and I find that those things benefit people, that actually improve the quality of their life or improve their success or improve their relationships, I'm very happy to do that. That means a lot to me. The way we interact with each other is so important. It's one of the reasons why, like, if someone gets canceled or you get publicly shamed, it's so devastating, because there's all these people that all this negative energy coming your way, and you feel it. As much as I like to pretend that you're immune to that kind of stuff, and some people do like to pretend that, you feel it. There's a tangible force when people are upset at you, and that's the same with loved ones or family, or anytime someone's upset at you, whether it's a giant group of people or there's a small amount of people. That has an impact on you and your psyche and your physical being. So the more you can spread love and the more love comes back to you, you also create this butterfly effect, right? Because where other people start recognizing, like, oh, you know, when he's nice to me, I feel better, and then I'm going to be nicer to people. And when I'm nicer to people, they feel better, and I feel better, and it spreads outward. And that's one thing that I've done through this podcast, I think, is I've imparted my personal philosophy on in kindness and generosity to other people.
So after watching this clip from Joe Rogan and Lex Friedman, I think it's safe to say that Joe really believes the meaning of life is to feel good and to help others feel good. Is that the meaning of life?
Well, I cued in on another part where he said that it has to do with love.
And love, of course.
And I think that is key. So, you know, when you ask people, large surveys in the U.S. and other countries, what is it that makes life most meaningful? You ask them open-ended questions, and then you have to categorize the responses. They mostly fall into a category of family and children. And you know, relationships. The second most important thing, which is like half as important, is work. Okay, so he mentioned, you know, work. You know, if you can have a job that you're actually passionate about, a lot of people don't have that luxury, right? A lot of people, they just got to make ends meet. But if you had to choose between like a great family life and a crummy job, or a crummy family life and a great job, choose the first, because that, you know, it's pretty clear from the data that even if you don't love your job, it's a means to an end, which is, you know, having enough to live. If you have good relationships, especially with your family, that seems to be the biggest factor in happiness and well-being.
Which is a pretty wild concept for me. Endurance, resilience come up out of that. The wild concept is how much more endurance we can have, how much more resiliency we can have to a crummy job or profession that we maybe hate's a strong word, but don't absolutely love and get excited to go to. But man, when you talk to people, me, when the endurance and resiliency have to be there day after day, year after year with family, close relationships, people that more or less aren't really going anywhere, that really gnaws at you. And so having the latter is way more powerful and way more meaningful and way more bearable. There's a power of choice, really, you know, to a certain degree.
Yeah.
You can't choose your family. You can choose to not talk to them. You can choose to not see them. And you can choose to build a new family with your partner, your spouse, your friends, your community. But with the job and profession, more or less, we always have way more choice. I think that's an interesting, influential component to endurance and human resiliency.
Yeah, interesting.
Which brings me to the last question. Being resilient, developing physical and mental resiliency is what we're all about here at Everforward Radio to help us move forward in life. Everforward, I say.
Yeah.
What do those two words mean to you? If I were to ask you, how do you live a life ever forward? Dr. Wilkinson, what does that look like? What does that feel like?
That to me, that I get the strong sense that it means progress, and that you're going to keep working at yourself, at your job, whatever it is. You're not going to give up. I believe really in a universe where kind of individual progress, not in a bad way. We were talking earlier about, if you focus too much on individual, then that's not a good thing. But one of the purposes of life, as I see it, is to overcome your weaknesses and accentuate your strengths. And that to me means progress, which is what I think of when you say, when I think of ever forward.
There's never a right or wrong answer, I say, but I want to piggyback real quick off of what you said about overcoming your weaknesses. Yeah. Did I get it right? For me, I immediately think of my mindset when I think overcoming weaknesses is more accepting of my circumstances. And if I choose to go, I'm not going to look at this as a weakness and something that I need to just figure out. I'm going to accept my circumstances. I feel like then I don't have any weaknesses. And if I can learn to accept things that are going well, things that are strengths, things that are weaknesses, it all kind of blends in to be the same. And then I learn to develop a healthier relationship to no matter what my circumstances are. And I no longer have that, I'm weak in this area, I'm strong in that area. I just have more total package kind of endurance and resilience, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, we're going to have all of your information in the new book linked down in the show notes, the video notes for everybody. But where can they go now to learn more about humans, evolution, the meaning of life, just casual light reading across the board?
I do have a book website. It's samueltwilkinson.com. Remember the T, samueltwilkinson.com, that gives a little bit of an overlay of some of these ideas.
Not to be confused with samuelljackson.com. You're in good company there. But Purpose, you guys definitely check out the book. Like I said, I have it linked for you. I really enjoyed the way that you laid it out.
Thank you.
The format, there's a lot of science in there that we can dive into, but there's a lot of digestible information that I think is going to make sense for people of all walks of life, of belief systems. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Chase.
My pleasure. Yeah.